What is the Feast of Weeks, also known as Shavu or the Feast of Pentecost? And what is its importance? What's going on, everybody? My name is William A. Horton, and I'm going to be your host today. The Feast of Weeks or Pentecost is a spring festival that follows the Passover. It begins by waving a sheaf in the air the day after the Sabbath, and then it continues by counting 7 weeks up until the 50th day. The 7th Sabbath, the day after that, is when the festival begins. Count off 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing grain. Then celebrate the festival of weeks to the Lord your God by giving him a free will offering in proportion to the blessing the Lord your God has given you. And rejoice before the Lord your God in the place he has chosen as a dwelling for his name. You, your sons and your daughters, your male and your female servants, the Levites in your town, and the foreigners, the fatherless and the widow living among you. And like I said, it's known by several different names throughout the Bible. The Hebrew call it Shavu, literally meaning weeks, talking about the 7 weeks that they're counting up to. It's known as the Festival of Harvest. It's also known as the Day of the First Fruit because it's the beginning of the Spring Harvest Festival. Now that can be a little bit confusing because the beginning of the 7 weeks is also called the Day of the First Fruit. And in the New Testament, it's called Pentecost, literally meaning 50 from the Greek word. The first day the sheaf is waved to begin the starting of the grain harvest. And 7 weeks later, the celebration begins. The festival takes place. At the end of the 7 weeks, when the celebration takes place, when the Festival of Weeks starts, or the Feast of Pentecost starts, is when the first fruit offering is made. In ancient times, the grain harvest lasted 7 weeks, and it began with the harvest of barley at Passover, and it ended with the harvest of wheat at the Festival of Weeks, or the Feast of Pentecost. The Torah states that the sheaf was the first fruit, the beginning of the barley harvest, the day after the Sabbath. And it continued for 7 weeks. And on the 7th Sabbath, the following day, the first fruits were offered again in the form of bread. It's interesting to note that the bread that they gave at this point had yeast in it, because it follows the feast of unleavened bread, which means that there was no leaven or no yeast in the bread. The significance is that we're letting go of the old yeast, and we're making room to bring in the new yeast, to bring in the new leaven. So the Passover, we learn to let go of the old leaven, and the day of Pentecost, the festival or the feast of Pentecost or the festival of works, we learn to bring in the new leaven. So what is the new leaven? The Feast of Pentecost commemorates the giving of the commandments on Mount Sinai. We removed the leaven of men on Passover, and we gained the leaven of God on Pentecost. The Feast of Pentecost is a festival of joy, and mandatory and voluntary offerings were made during these times, including the first fruit of the wheat harvest. The significance of this festival was to show dedication to the Lord by bringing him an offering. The Feast of Pentecost would have taken place in the spring, what we would know as May or June, between May and June now. The Jewish calendar follows a lunar cycle. That means it goes from one full moon to the next. And the Feast of Pentecost starts in Sivan. We find the Feast of Pentecost in many different books, in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We even find it in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, and in 1 Corinthians. The Feast of Pentecost gives people a chance to thank God for the abundance in which he's given them. The reason why I chose Pentecost, the Feast of Pentecost, is because I'm Pentecostal, and the day of Pentecost is something very significant in my book and in my head because it's the day that the Holy Spirit rained down upon the people on the day of Pentecost. And the interesting thing about the day of Pentecost is that there would have been all these people gathered together at this precise moment to have this festival. And the Holy Spirit came and he rained down with tongues of fire, and people were filled and baptized with the Holy Spirit that day, and 3,000 people were added to the church that day. And I wanted you guys to know the significance behind the whole story of Pentecost, because for myself, when I thought about the Pentecost, and I always just thought about it as a day that happened in the New Testament. I really had no backstory and understanding of what the Feast of Pentecost really was. So I hope this better explains what the Feast of Pentecost was and why it's important and the significance of it. Thank you guys for joining me. I'm sweating here, I'm dying, so I hope you guys like this movie. Bye.